Good morning. Thanks for coming. My name is Joe Ryan. I'm an associate professor in the School of Social Work and co-director of the Child and Adolescent Data Lab in the School of Social Work. We welcome you to the 2017 Fidel F. Fauri and Iris M. Fauri Memorial Conference. For those that don't know, Fidel had a long and distinguished career in social services, was actually a graduate of this law school, dean of the School of Social Work, and actually appointed by Governor Romney, George Romney that is, not Mitt, for a special counsel on juvenile delinquency. Today we have speakers from various backgrounds to speak on Raise the Age here in Michigan. So Michigan is either way ahead of the curve or way behind the times and out of step with science when it comes to how we treat 17-year-olds in the juvenile justice system. We are one of only 5 states that treats 17-year-olds as adults. So with our speakers today and input from everyone here, perhaps we can figure out where we actually sit on that curve and think about a way forward. I should note that we welcome all thoughts and positions, those both in favor of raising the age, those not in favor of raising the age. A thoughtful debate is, in the end, a productive endeavor. The day will include 2 keynote speakers, 2 panels, and we'll end with a little bit time for discussion. There are CEUs available, so you have to sign in the back and sign out at the end. So that's just sort of a housekeeping issue. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dean Lynn Videcka, the Dean of our School of Social Work. I know many of you have traveled a long way to get here, but trust me, Dean Videcka has traveled the furthest. I know I drove from Detroit, I'm from Grand Rapids. The Dean flew in from Shanghai? Beijing. Oh, my bad. So that's, I don't know what that is, 7,000 miles? So I'm not up to speed on our reimbursement policies, but I'm not so sure we pay 53 cents a mile on that entire trip. So while the Dean has one more sip of coffee and shakes off jet lag, let me say a little bit about her background. Lynn has a long history and interest in social services, in particular around children and families involved with state systems of care, including child welfare, juvenile justice, and mental health. Dean Videcka has published close to 50 articles and book chapters and served on numerous editorial boards. She's held many national leadership positions in the field of social work, including the president of the National Association of Deans and Directors of Social Work, the Institute for the Advancement of Social Work Research, vice president of the Society for Social Work and Research, and commissioner on the Accreditation and the Council of Social Work Education. Prior to joining us here at Michigan, Dean Videcka was dean at SUNY Albany, vice president for research at SUNY Albany, and dean at New York University. I clearly need to get my act together. Dean Videcka is a graduate from the School of Social Service Administration at the University of Chicago, where we both had the same academic advisor and mentor, John Sherman. Without further delay, let me introduce Dean Videcka.
Thanks so much, Joe. And he revealed my secret. If I'm looking a little bleary-eyed today, it's because I arrived home at Shanghai from Beijing at 7 p.m. last night, and it's now 9 p.m. China time, so my head is kind of spinning. I'm really honored to welcome you to the 2017 Fidel F. Fauri and Iris M. Fauri Memorial Conference. This is my second attendance at the conference. I've been at the school a year, and the conference is presented annually in recognition of our former University of Michigan Vice President and the very first dean of our School of Social Work, Fidel F. Fauri, and his wife, Iris. So we're so pleased. Joe told you a little bit about Fidel, and I'll say a few other things about him, but we are so pleased today to have Dean Fauri's daughter, Greta Fauri, and his niece, Lauren Fauri Thompson, joining us today for the conference. So could you rise up and we can recognize you? So let me just say a few more words about Dean Fauri's leadership in the field of child welfare. It spanned over 50 years, with much of the current social welfare legislation, both at the state and national level, being a product of Dean Fauri's activities and vision, both in his roles as director of Michigan Department of Social Services and then his years in Washington, D.C., where he held numerous leadership positions. This lecture series is funded by gifts from the Fauri family, alumni, and friends, and is intended to serve as a forum for discussing the most important ideas and challenges of the day that are focused on enhancing the well-being of young people. This year's conference, entitled Raise the Age, examines just one of those very important, not only child development issues and adolescent development issues, but also social justice issues. And this conference will look at the benefits and implications of raising the age of jurisdiction to 18 years. As Joe said, all but 5 states have a jurisdiction of 18 for adulthood, and the exceptions are the states of Georgia, Michigan, Missouri, Texas, and Wisconsin. So today we'll have the opportunity to address this critical legislation, and I know that our own state legislature is considering this issue at this very moment, so it's a critical juncture in terms of state policy decision making. And this will give us an opportunity to learn about the activities and advocacy that's underway and to explore strategies for how we can work together to improve the lives of young people rather than incarcerate them. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Daniel Keating. Dr. Keating is professor of psychology, psychiatry, and pediatrics, and a research professor at the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan. He has previously served on the faculties of the University of Minnesota, University of Maryland, University of Toronto, and as visiting scientist at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin. His current research focuses on the impact of early life adversity on child and youth development and on the neurodevelopmental pathways in adolescent risk behavior. He has also served as an expert witness on hearings to review the sentencing of juvenile life without parole. His most recent book, published in 2017, is entitled Born Anxious: The Lifelong Impact of Early Life Adversity and How to Break the Cycle. Please join me for the day. Have a wonderful learning experience, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Keating.
Thank you very much, Lynn. I appreciate that, and I'm delighted to be here. Which is a sort of conventional thing to say, I know, but I am. I've had the opportunity to do some named conferences at other places, most recently at Brown, but there's something very nice about being able to do it here at home. So thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm very much looking forward to the day. What I'd like to do, and I'll have some PowerPoints in just a moment to kind of walk us through this. I do think there's an important science story that can inform how we think about justice, juvenile justice issues. And I do want to work through that without painstaking detail, but enough detail to suggest why we should put this into the mix as we're debating this important policy issue. Before I get into some of the details, though, let me jump to the chase, as they say. There are three kind of key issues or three kind of key conclusions that are pretty straightforward that are quite robust in the literature that bear on the argument. And I'll talk about the background for them as I go along. The first thing that I want to point out, and there's massive evidence for this, is that desistance for youth criminal behavior is the rule. Most individuals who get engaged in one way or another with the juvenile justice system, or in some cases, unfortunately, the criminal justice system, wind up desisting from that behavior typically by around the mid-20s. If you look at well-done population studies, a whole host of other studies, and in fact, going back to Quetelet's original work on the age crime curve, it's very clear desistance is what happens in the normal course of events. So that's well-established fact one. And we're dealing in a fact universe here, right? I assume we're all on the same page that facts matter for these kinds of policy debates. So that's fact one. Fact two, and there's not as much work on this, but there's some very solid work done on this in a variety of places, including my colleague Jeff Fagan in New York, that desistance probability is increased when individuals are in the juvenile justice system rather than in the adult criminal system. They do better, and he and others have done other similar studies, did a fairly comprehensive study looking at waivers into the adult system, comparing lots of other things, because he used a New York area where there were a lot of things that were similar, but comparing different regimes around this in New York and New Jersey. And it was pretty clear that kids' probability of being in that desistance group increases when they are being dealt with in the juvenile justice system. And I think that's perhaps not as long-standing as the age crime curve and the evidence on desistance, but it's I think, pretty solid empirical finding. And the third one is one that I'll spend a bit more time talking about the details for, is that the plasticity of brain development, the neuroplasticity of brain development, remains quite strong through the adolescent years. What that means is the capacity for rehabilitation, the capacity for positive developmental growth remains quite high. We can take advantage of that, or we can toss it away, but the reality is that it's there to be used. And I'll talk about what some of the background for that is. Okay, so I hate to boil what I think is a kind of an interesting talk that takes a while down to 3 takeaway points, but just to know where we're going, those are the ones that matter. Okay, so in terms of where the things I'd like to talk about, the title I have here is The Developing Brain, which is the plasticity story. I didn't yet talk about the notion of a children's rights perspective on this, and it may not seem immediately obvious how that comes into neuroplasticity and connects with that in important ways, but I hope to show that to you, talk about that a bit. And then the juvenile justice system and what that does, what that can do for us in a variety of ways in terms of making progressive choices in this area. Okay, so what I want to talk about then in terms of organizing this, I want to talk a little bit about what have we learned about developmental maturity as it relates to juvenile justice, and not just the brain. I think one of the things I do want to emphasize here, even though it is the case, no one's written the complete story on this, but I think it's pretty accurate, is that the brain story was in many ways more persuasive in judicial circles than all of the developmental evidence of all kinds that we put together over decades, right? We can talk about cognitive development, social development, emotional development, all kinds of development, but it was all often looked at, I shouldn't say dismissed, but maybe looked at a bit askance as a kind of a, soft-headed, liberal biased, yada, yada, right? When we start presenting pictures of brains at different ages, all of a sudden people sit up and say, oh, there must be something to this. The fact that almost everything that we want to draw on to tell the story of what's going on here is entirely consistent with what we've been saying for decades, studying cognitive development, social development, emotional development. It didn't have the same impact. So I do want to talk a little bit about that because I think the strongest evidence around all of this stuff comes when we have convergence of evidence, right? Or to use the sort of fancier term out of the philosophy of science, consilience of evidence, meaning that we've drawn evidence from multiple different levels, multiple different modalities, and when we look at it as a whole, it makes a whole lot more sense than when we look at each of them individually. So I want to try to point what that out is. I do, though, then want to talk a bit about what does the new neuroscience research tell us about adolescent development. We have been doing this kind of work, and by we I mean we, the field. We're doing that as well. But the imaging tools that we now have available are just vastly more sophisticated and able to reveal various kinds of things that are going on. I don't want to go into the technology of it, but we have had sort of the caps to do EEGs for many years and have used those in research very productively. MRI to look at structural changes in the brain, and then functional MRI, fMRI, are relatively new tools in the sense that they've been around and applied to adolescent development over the last couple or 3 decades at the most. And then we're moving into a variety of other things that tell us even more interesting stories, things like diffusion tensor imaging that talk about how the brain is connected, the various parts of the brain are connected to each other and how mature those connections are. And then I'll talk a bit about what I see as the major legal implications of this expanding knowledge, and within that, come back and loop back into some of the rights issues. Standing in the law school here, I'm a little abashed to be talking about legal issues, but there you go. And you all can correct me when I go astray. Okay. Just to define what I'm talking about here and what we mean by adolescence, the data that I'm talking about here is there are various ways you can define what we mean by adolescence. Most commonly, people refer to it as the second decade of life in the research literature, basically 10 to 20 years. There are some changes that are relevant to the adolescent transition that occur prior to age 10, particularly adrenarche, which kind of is the precursor to launching the pubertal cascade, begins around 8 or 9. And as I'll talk about, brain development continues into the mid-20s, like basic structural brain development continues into the 20s. But we can use that second decade of life as a ballpark. As I'll mention in a moment, it's a period of transition in many different domains. Right? It is, in a sense, the most plastic and open the system will be, the human organism system will be, since infancy, since fetal development and infancy, and is the most plastic period for the rest of one's life, right? So there are lots of things that can happen then. One of the implications of that is that it's a prime time for intervention. If what we're really trying to do, if our goal is to, in effect, increase the probabilities of rehabilitation, decrease the probability of recidivism, this is a golden opportunity to do that. And we squander it at our peril and at the peril of the kids that we work with. And the other thing, and this becomes important to the brain story, is that not all these changes are well coordinated, right? They don't all just fit together in a particular cascade fashion where one thing follows sequentially. Some things surge ahead, other things lag behind, and there are individual differences in that as well. Okay. So just a very quick summary what the behavioral and scientific and psychological literature says about this, and many of you I'm sure already know this, so I won't dwell on it, but just taking a look at some of these other the areas before we start talking about the brain. One is the area of cognitive development. That's been a particular interest of mine throughout my career. There are very many important changes that are going on during the adolescent period. There has been steady growth through middle and later childhood, but it takes on a different quality during this particular period of time. one thing, kids know a lot more stuff, so that makes it easier to think about things. But their ability to think about the consequences of things, to do planning, to do a variety of things becomes much better. Now, you might instinctively think, well, isn't that kind of the opposite of the story that we think about as adolescents as being more impulsive and so forth and so on? And we have to distinguish here by this kind of cognitive development. We're talking about under ideal or laboratory or experimental conditions. How do adolescents compare with children in terms of their ability to think about the future, to plan, to organize facts in a coherent way? It's much better. That doesn't mean that they can apply that to life. It just means that they have the cognitive capacity to undertake that more sophisticated analysis of things. As I'll talk about in a number of other occasions during the talk, there aren't any really sharp age markers. We can't say that this birthday is the marker. And I know I'll come back to this for legal purposes. In some cases, we need to do that. But in terms of actual human development, we don't firm age markers are not very useful. They're a little more useful in very young organisms because certain things have to happen in a maturing sequence, but by the time we get to adolescence, that's not the case. In terms of social development, there are a couple of important things that bear on these issues. One is, of course, that kids have a lot more behavioral autonomy. They can make their own choices about what they're doing. They're no longer kind of reliant on and dependent on the parents to kind of make choices and guide them and so forth. And this is a challenging issue for many families. At the moment, I'm blessed with 3 adolescents at home, and so I understand, sort of the both of the autonomy that they want to have and the fact that, their ability to get along with each other and have conflicts with each other and resolve those conflicts is largely out of my control anymore, right? It's hard not to want to do that, but the reality is they're becoming their own people. They are their own people in many important ways, and we have to acknowledge that. The other thing that goes on in the social development domain is the tremendously increased impact of peers and attention to peers and being drawn to peers. This is a huge impact, and I'll talk a little bit about how it actually affects brain function in fMRI imaging. When an individual is doing a task, particularly if it's a kind of risk-reward task, like a gambling task, or should you run the red light or stop at the red light in a simulated driving task, the brain changes, not only behavior, but the brain actually lights up differently if you're doing that with a peer versus when you're doing it alone. And it pushes in the direction you might imagine, taking more risks. Okay, there is an affiliative component to this, of course, right? You want to connect up with peers. Let me back up a second. What I'm talking about here is entirely normative development. I'm not talking about kids who may have become involved with the justice system in one way or another. I'm not talking about kids who show some kind of psychopathology. I'm not talking about kids exclusively who are on some syndrome or some spectrum of some of those issues. This is the typical and in many ways necessary course of adolescent development. In emotional development, no big surprise for those who have been around adolescents lately or recall any of your own experiences, is there's increased moodiness, there's lability of mood, it goes up and down, and that these emotional feelings are very, very strong, that are partly driven by brain-based sorts of issues. There is, and I'll talk about this in just a moment, but there's a lot more arousal, a lot more sensitivity to reward, but at the same time, there are also hormonal changes that are going on. So the changes that come along with puberty, the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, the HPG axis, the outcome of that is to generate a much larger surge of sex steroids, mostly testosterone for boys, mostly estrogen and progesterone for girls, but not exclusively so, not split exactly by gender, but those are the predominant ones. Those create a neurochemical set of neurochemical reactions that are new to that individual. The hormones are not new. They've been there since, fetal period, but the proportion of them and their influence is increased. And then for all of those reasons, the emotional ability, the social desire to sort of be on your own and create your own world, but also to strongly affiliate with peers, the ability to think through things at some level, all, at a planning level and so forth, all have implications for the kind of judgment that individuals are able to make when they are confronted with some real life situation. So this is all the, not all the evidence. This is the kind of evidence that we've had for decades. We continue to accumulate it and refine it, but basically the story that we know about adolescent behavioral and psychological development has been known for some period of time. The new player in the game is, of course, our increasingly sophisticated understanding, which still has a long way to go, but our increasingly sophisticated understanding of adolescent neurodevelopment, adolescent brain development. The metaphor that's been used a lot, and for good reasons, I think, is that what you have is a kind of a brain development where it's all accelerator, all going forward, going outwards, doing stuff, and no brakes. It doesn't have a system to apply the brakes very well to stop that drive, right? And so, specifically, what we see is are substantial increases in exploration and sensation-seeking mechanisms. We've already known that, right, from the behavioral evidence, that this is a characteristic of adolescent development. That relates to the kinds of behavioral choices that individuals make, to the kinds of romantic involvements that they get into, and to their risk-taking behavior. So this is what was colloquially known as the bottom brain. It's also known as the limbic system. It involves a variety of different brain structures. Most prominently, that have been studied the most, are the amygdala, which is a kind of the arousal mechanism, often associated with fear, but not exclusively so, or sort of just getting thrill-seeking and that kind of stuff. It becomes more activated. The ventral striatum is a system that essentially has a lot to do with the risk and reward component, that we're willing to take bigger risks in the hope of getting a bigger reward. So we're seeking out new kinds of things during this period of time. And the third big player in here that's related to these is an increase in what's known as the dopaminergic system, the increase of dopamine. And dopamine is, of course, the neurochemical that is that tags something as, oh, that was good, let's have more of that. Right? So the dopamine essentially is a kind of a pleasure receptor, and it not just sexual pleasure or food pleasure of any kind really, but it's a mechanism that we have built in that says, aha, that was good. Let's tag where that happened, what was I doing, how did I get that thing, so that I can keep doing it, right? Huge increases in all of those, in amygdala arousal, ventral striatum, risk and reward systems, and dopaminergic sort of tagging of pleasurable kinds of things. What that creates, this is the accelerator, right? You want to have that stuff. You want to go out and get that stuff, right? Unfortunately, of course, one of the things that stimulates it is not just what you're doing behaviorally or interacting with others, it's also can come from substances, and so that is one of the reasons that kids are most susceptible to substance abuse and addiction if they get started early. That's one of the strong reasons, among others, but it's one of the strong reasons to try to prevent that sort of exposure early on, because the system is so attuned to it that it's much more likely to latch onto it and keep going. Even more so, parentheses here, because I don't know none of us know what the rest of the story is, nicotine receptors, nicotinic receptors, also proliferate at a huge rate during this period of time for reasons we don't quite understand. What that means is that very modest exposure to smoking, very modest exposure to nicotine before about age 17 or so increases the probability of lifelong addiction to nicotine by an order of magnitude, by probably 8 to 10 times or more. And the reason is that once you give it the nicotine, those receptors, which in the normal course of events would just die off because they don't have any particular use. I mean, they have a use, but they don't have any, very important, strong use. They would just die off over time. If you just give them a little bit, and by a little bit, I mean a pack a week for a couple of months when you're 14, is enough to create a lifelong addiction. Because they say, oh, this is good, we'll keep this, we want more. No, you can't not do it, we want more, etc. Right? Okay, so that's this kind of, close parentheses, that's the kind of accelerating brain, accelerating in the sense of trying to go out, explore the world, find new sensations, and so forth. And there's some interesting emerging evidence, both behaviorally and in terms of brain development, that relates this pattern to what we have always thought of as a generic adolescent complaint, but probably has a brain basis. I'm bored. I'm really bored. And basically, it's that what you did yesterday that gave the system the kick that you wanted is no longer giving you that kick. So you need to push the envelope to get that sensation feeling, right? The implications for being able to maintain control of that behavior are obvious. That is, you're going to need a system that's able to rein that in, right? And say, well, wait a minute, that might not be a great choice, all right? And that, of course, then, is the job of the prefrontal cortex, sometimes known as the top brain, and it's really more appropriate to talk about the prefrontal system. And essentially, the prefrontal cortex is the seat of what we typically think of as a lot of the higher order cognitive functions. So executive functions that entail things like making judgments about things, being able to plan out future activities, being able to inhibit impulsive behaviors. All of those are pretty much situated in the prefrontal cortex, and I refer to it as a prefrontal system because it's not just that you see a substantial amount of growth during adolescence in that prefrontal cortex. I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute, but that it is sending out connectors, circuits, to the rest of the brain. So ultimately, after all this gets done by around the mid-20s, the prefrontal system, in a sense, is not just the seat of judgment or impulse control or higher order thinking. It's also the governor of the brain. It allows you to control what's going on in the rest of your brain. It allows you to delegate activities to other parts of the brain to free up more of those prefrontal resources. So one of the problems when we're looking at why adolescents get involved in risky behaviors that may be bad for them, whether it's in a justice legal setting or whether it's health risk behaviors, which is what our current NIH grant is focusing on, that function is limited in a couple of ways. One is that it grows a lot slower than the bottom brain, right? It is growing, and it's, a lot of the cognitive development stuff I talked about depends on that growth, but it's growing at a much slower and a much more linear rate. There's no big surge there, right? The second is that means you've got a limited resource for planning, anticipating problems, making good judgments about things. So you have that limitation, but also it has less control over the rest of the brain, right? As adults, we're able to delegate stuff to other parts of the brain and say, take over. Why is that important? Because once you've delegated it, that means you've freed up the central resource to do other things, right? So that if you, in fact, have your prefrontal system fully engaged in doing something, in order to carry that out, you need to use all of that resource. If something comes up that you also need to do, you're kind of out of luck. For adults, it's relatively easier. A good example is, and actually a real world example out of the literature that we look at in health, is graduated driver licensing, right? This all accelerator and no brakes, it didn't come out of that domain, but it's highly relevant to it. We study morbidity and mortality during the second decade of life, and it's a much higher level of morbidity and mortality than it ought to be. if we were merely looking at what the physiology of the system is, right? The second decade of life is the healthiest physiology at a population level we're ever going to see. You've already encountered all the childhood immune diseases and various kinds of problems pretty much. Your immune system is matured, you're able to deal with that. There are exceptions, obviously cancers can originate during adolescence and so forth, but generally speaking, it's very physiologically attuned and a well-oiled machine, so to speak. And we have not yet begun the decline, gradually we hope, that begins by the mid-20s or so as our various systems begin to accumulate wear and tear and show up with various kinds of health problems along the way. So it's highly physiologically robust, but we have this high impact that comes for morbidity and mortality that comes not from the physiology but from behavior, which we refer to as behavioral misadventure as a catch-all term, right? Reckless driving and so forth is a huge contributor to teenage mortality as drivers or as passengers in cars driven by adolescents. A huge chunk of serious injury and mortality comes from that. The graduated driver licensing program, very interestingly, there's been some very good studies of this out of the public health literature, has reduced over the last couple of decades, has reduced the teen fatalities from teen drivers by about 40%, maybe even a little bit more than that. Remarkably, it does it in a sense by taking, it wasn't the plan at the time, this came long before the brain evidence was available, but essentially it said kids can't pay attention to that many different things at the same time. You need to get it to the point where they are their expertise in being able to navigate the car, understand the context, make decisions about various kinds of things. It takes a long time to develop that expertise. Let's restrict their use during the period while they're acquiring the expertise before we let them out completely on their own, right? What that allows the individual to do is to devote all of their prefrontal resources to the task of safe driving. One of the most important components of the graduated driver's licensing is not allowing a novice teen driver to drive in a car that has non-related minors in the car. Because the worst situation that you get there is they're driving a car with their friends in the car. Well, what are they drawn to pay attention to? The peers. They're not going to pay attention to driving. They're paying attention to the peers. Plus a huge boost of testosterone when you're going to tailgate or pass in a double line or all those other kinds of things that they would egg you on to. There's been studies of that too, field studies that show the worst driving is male teen drivers with male teen passengers. Far and away. I will point out the second worst is dads with teens in the car, but let's leave that aside for the moment. And so the pattern there is that it takes some time. It takes some expertise, both because the brain is still developing and because you just don't have much experience with things, right? And so the ability to do that is one that needs to be scaffolded and supported and so forth. I'll talk about that a little bit more. So what we have here, and the dominant notion in the field, is what we talk about as a developmental maturity mismatch. And this is exactly what we're studying with respect to health risk. We have some data that looks at legal risk behaviors, and the same kind of story is one that we're focusing on. And basically a developmental maturity mismatch, the hypothesis is, and there's some evidence to support this, that it is what underlies a lot of adolescent risk behavior, including both criminal activity, but also health issues. So let's, don't want to overburden us early in the morning, but this is what I just said in all the however many words I use. This is a quick picture that encapsulates most of it. So down here, and this is not, as I say, we don't have firm ages for all of this, but this is a schematic to show the main point. So down here we have kind of an early, middle, and later adolescence, and then the mature adult. If we wanted to put sort of like, 10 to 13 here, 14 to 16 here, 17 to 20 here, 20s here, mid-20s and beyond here, it roughly would coincide. Okay, so that's our developmental marker. On this axis, we have the degree to which there's how much of the functional activation of that particular system is present during each of these developmental stages, right? Compared to what the mature adult level will look like. Excuse me. So this is what is typically referred to as that bottom brain or limbic system, entailing a number of different neural circuits, amygdala, ventral striatum, and dopaminergic as the primary ones. And what you can see is that it goes up very fast, right? In fact, it peaks at well above adult levels, right? It peaks well above adult levels. And then by late adolescence begins slowly to taper off and then comes down to more like what the adult level will be, right? So by mid-20s, individuals are, and then beyond, are less, in a sense, subject to the whims of arousal or risks and so forth. This is a good time to say, I'm talking here again about normative adolescence, populations of adolescents. There are vast individual differences here. Some individuals don't ever come back down. Some individuals remain, pretty phlegmatic through it all, to go back to the old, four humors system of personality. Anyway, they remain pretty calm and, unaffected by a lot of these things. So there are huge differences. So that's what, in a sense, the bottom brain is doing, and that's the accelerator part of the story. This more linear line, this more gradually linear growth, is representing the growth in the prefrontal cortex and the prefrontal system more generally, and that is going along and is both increasing in volume relative to the brain as a whole. As you probably know, the prefrontal cortex is by far the most dominant feature of the brain that differentiates us from our other primate cousins, our closest primate cousins. And looking back in paleo neurology, it's very clear that this was a distinguishing feature of Homo sapiens. Essentially, humans, as you probably know, have a brain relative to body size that's larger than any other mammal, but within that, it is the prefrontal cortex that is much larger comparatively relative to other closest relatives. And that difference comes about primarily during the adolescent period. So by saying this one's going slower and more linear, I don't mean to say it's not important or huge. It is, in a sense, our distinguishing characteristic. All these other things, that bottom brain, limbic brain, that's very similar across all primates. It's very similar across many mammals, in fact, right? It's what, it's the arousal system. It tags things that you should remember as good and keep doing, and so forth and so on. Okay. So what we then see is that this mismatch, right, is what's described as, or you can think about as the area under the curve. This is trying to control this, right? And it's not easy, right? That's part of the reason, as kids are learning how to inhibit impulses, to do planning about the real world rather than just, that they can do in tasks, but to do it in the real world, making good judgments, good decision making, and so forth. That's going to develop slowly. That's one of the reasons that they need scaffolding from adults, even though they're into this adolescent period and they may not see any need to have any adult scaffolding, but they benefit from it. But it also means that the system remains quite plastic during this period of time. It remains available to be dealt with in terms of various kinds of things that can support it to move in a particular kind of direction. Okay, so the risks that we're talking about here that emanate from that developmental maturity mismatch, there are a number of them. They match up with some of the stuff I talked about before, but I think it's important to go through them individually. Perhaps the most common one that people think about and that makes, in a sense, the most intuitive sense, in fact, someone wrote a very good article recently, is that this notion of a developmental maturity mismatch where you've got this kind of accelerator and no brakes. is just too good a story not to be true, so why bother to investigate it? But one of our arguments is, well, it would be nice to actually know empirically, sort of how that works, and so it was persuasive enough to NIH. But it clearly does fit with what a lot of our presumptions and biases and so forth are. Impulsivity. It's very hard to stop once you've gotten going on some course of action. You're getting all of this like sensation, that's what you were seeking. You may be getting pleasure from it, that's what you were seeking. You're getting peer rewards and peer status from it, that's what you were seeking. All of these things are pushing you to keep doing the thing and pushing the envelope further and further, right? That's what's driving that system. And it is probably, I don't like just so stories in evolution, but it's probably a darn good thing, because as a species, we needed to get out there and find all kinds of new ways to get along. We don't have much in the way of natural defenses or prey, right? I mean, if we had to chase down our food and, deal with it with our hands, we'd be, not here. And so we had to have people who were going to go out and explore and find out what's out there in the broader world and bring that information back. And, both developmentally, because they're, sort of younger and more nimble and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we could probably afford to lose them a little more than the elders who had some of the wisdom of the troop. That's a normative thing, right? I don't want to come across here that, oh gosh, this is terrible, adolescents are impulsive, right? It's a terrible thing. It's not. It's normative and it's good, right? But it is one that creates opportunities to be engaged in behavior that's problematic. This is not really contradictory. I'll say it's a paradox, but one of the important things that we've been finding is that when kids do risky things, whether it's health related or things that, sort of engaging in relatively softer criminal activity of one sort or another, it's not all impulsive. Sometimes they plan to take risks. They were actually intending to do this. So when we do our surveys, we don't just ask prevalence questions, and we ask it about alcohol, tobacco, marijuana, all kinds of different drugs, getting involved in fights, taking weapons to school, unsafe sexual practices that create health risks and so forth. We ask a whole range of things. When they endorse something, we then go back and ask them, when you engaged in this, was it something that you planned to do, or did it just kind of happen, right? And a large part of the time, maybe not the majority, but a very substantial amount of the time, they did. It wasn't like they just, they happened to be in the woods and a case of beer appeared. I mean, it's not that, right? They planned to meet up, right? And they may have had some idea that maybe sex would happen, but gee, bringing a condom, that's a little extra thought, right? And so the planfulness, right, is something that is definitely there. But I go back to the thing that I mentioned earlier on. You can plan to engage in a risky behavior, and you may even plan to have some kinds of, backup plans or something, right? But in the heat of the moment, right, you may not have enough prefrontal resources available to you because you're executing the plan that you started with. Something goes south, you're, up the river without a paddle because, in fact, you don't have any resources left to be able to figure out, oh, now what, right? And so you're much more likely to just kind of go with the flow at that point. So even if it was planful to start, doesn't mean that impulsivity doesn't play a role at some later point in time, right? Not always, right? I mean, you intended to get that illicit drug and you sought it out and you used it on purpose and, whatever, right? That was planned. But there are things that can go wrong that make it difficult to back away from this. Okay, so carrying out a plan that goes awry, your prefrontal resources might have already been used up. Let me go back to the driving example, which kind of makes it more, kind of illustrates this point. I'm sure that every one of you has had the experience, like driving from home to work, right, that you do all the time, every day. and you're driving along, you've got something on your mind and whatever, and all of a sudden you arrive at your parking space and you say, how did I get here? I don't remember, right? And that's because you've automated that, right? You've got an automated plan for that, and you have enough resources for expertise. If along the way somebody ran a red light in front of you and you had to slam on your brakes, you'd remember that, right? But if it goes without incident, right, it's just not there. But that's because you have so much expertise and spare resources, right? That it's a very straightforward thing to be able to do, and you can delegate. Watching and scanning everything around you for safety, you can delegate to your visual motor cortex. You don't have to keep that right in the front of your head all of the time. You know how to do that sort of thing, right? Kids don't, right? Driving is one of the examples, but other things, kids don't have that, and they certainly don't have the spare resources in those situations. Already mentioned then the limbic part. There's an increased intensity of desires. There's a strong desires and wants and things that you want to be able to do. Among them is affiliating with peers, right? Your social status depends on being able to hang out with your peers and do the things that your peers are doing. And if you ditch that, you can very well wind up losing lots of social status or being excluded from the group altogether. And who wants that, right? And so this sort of passion for both doing things, exploring things, having sensations, and connecting with the group is a tremendous passion drive. And I don't just mean sexual passion or romantic passion. I'm talking about the general passion to do stuff, right? I recently did a piece for a popular outlet. We're essentially saying that in many ways, if we look at both, sort of the jihadi movement that Scott Atran has written about, or the white supremacists that we saw in Charlottesville, this is part of it. They see themselves as belonging to a group that has a goal and a purpose and a mission, and it makes them feel good. They have managed, somebody, to capture that passion for this extremely unfortunate behaviors, but that passion has been captured. So one of the things at a broader social level we need to think about, how do we capture the passion of adolescents to do positive stuff? What can we do to make them feel, boy, this is really cool to do this, right? And one of the things is that because that passion, if you will, I'm kind of going broadly metaphorical. I'm a little farther away from the detailed empirical stuff here, you may told. But to the extent that that's there to be captured, one of the goals of a juvenile justice system should be to try to figure out how to capture that passion to something that's positive, how to get them engaged in something that they can see that this matters more than themselves, that they matter to other people, and other people matter to them, and people count on them to do something, right? That unfortunately, currently, some of our most visible things are being captured for passions that we are clearly quite antisocial, right? And it's certainly not only those cases. There are lots of cases of teens being deeply involved in social justice issues or saving the planet issues and so forth, and are deeply passionate about it. I don't mean to dismiss that we're not doing it at all, but I worry that we may not be doing it enough. Okay. As we've already talked about, the internal checks from the prefrontal system lags behind the ability to do this. It needs to be, in a sense, both maturing but also trained up to be able to do more of those sorts of things. And the external scaffolding from adults necessarily and appropriately declines, right? We're not sort of chasing after the 3-year-old to make sure she doesn't run out into the street, right? We can't do that with a 13-year-old, right? We shouldn't be doing that with a 13-year-old. And so that scaffolding, right, of trying to maintain enough of an external regulatory frame around them so that they don't get hurt, which is a primary requirement for us when we're parenting young kids, right? That has to go away, and we need to transfer that ability to regulate behavior in ways that keep them safe and on a positive developmental course to their own internal regulation, right? That transition is one of the most difficult transitions in parenting, and it's one of the most important transitions for adolescents, is that they move away from that. Now, there's a special case, of course, where that hasn't been true for those particular adolescents even when they were little. That's a different, I'll talk about that in a moment, but that's a different kind of thing. But even in the general case, that's very important. The other thing that there's some evidence on, and I've been particularly interested in this recently as I was writing the book that Dean Videka mentioned, is that stress responses also become more activated during this period of time. Even after controlling for a variety of things, the HPA axis that sort of starts an adrenaline cascade that eventually leads to cortisol and so forth, that fight or flight pattern, is more activated in adolescence than it is in childhood. And so their likelihood of that response being provoked in certain situations, which is a further, can be a further way of clouding one's judgment, is also the case. Now I want to be clear here, the stress system is an essential survival tool for all of us throughout life, right? You have to be able to respond to situations that are challenging or threatening or dangerous or whatever, and that's the system that we activate when we do that. But if it gets activated overly, it has the capacity to alter our behavior in the moment in ways that are not as good as we would like to see, but also has a cumulative effect over time of harming future development and future health. This is especially true for youth who have a history of early adversity. Have a contractual obligation to put the cover of the book up there. Just kidding. But this, in the book that came out in April, I tried to lay out the story for a very broad audience that this stress system is a very key piece to understand in terms of individual differences in the ability to cope with various kinds of challenges, particularly during the adolescent period. It's true throughout life, and I walk through all of the different stages of development in the book. But the point is that individuals who have had a history of early life adversity, which will characterize a very large proportion of the kids who become involved with the juvenile justice system, have even less capacity to deal with that stress situation. Their ability to cope with the stress is compromised at the same time that they're facing typically more objective stressors. So they're much more likely to be unable to work their way through a situation and out of a situation that is creating some risk for them and potentially risk for others as well, right? So that hyperactive stress system, or what we talk about as stress dysregulation, is definitely going to be more true for individuals who have a history of early life adversity. And it doesn't have to be like, high trauma. Although for individuals who have experienced high trauma in childhood, it's even worse, right? It manifests in a variety of ways. But one of the things is that the HPA axis is going to be out of sync. It's going to be out of whack. It's going to take any little slight, any little sign of disrespect and immediately escalate it to being, I have to fight my way to make sure I'm doing this. And so kids who have had this pattern are much more likely to have a hostile attribution bias, even neutral behaviors from others they interpret as hostile, that they have to then do something to restore their sense of dignity and respect and safety. And so that is another factor that is less researched, but there are a lot of people who are starting to work on it now, that we were not aware that it gets particularly activated in the normative adolescent development, but for kids who have had a history of early life adversity gets even more, becomes even more of a challenge during this period of time. Okay, so with all of that, sort of background, I think there are a variety of implications for how we deal with our justice policies, which are probably fairly self-evident at this point in time. But let's talk about them a bit. Developmental maturity, I would say, is a significant legal issue. There's a lot of science that suggests that a core development profile that characterizes adolescence is this mismatch between limbic, bottom brain, prefrontal, top brain, where the one is not yet able to control that. That, I think, has legal relevance in several different ways. The competence in the judicial system, that is the ability to understand what's happening to you in a judicial setting, to be able to assist in your own defense if that's expected, and so forth. The ability to make appropriate, mature legal judgments in a setting where you may be exposed to now some kind of a sanction risk is one that kids are not very good at until later on. Partly that's a prefrontal issue, partly it's an experiential issue, but partly it's because that system, that bottom brain, is one that unfortunately there is a lot of skill by investigators, prosecutors, and others to be able to try to manipulate your feeling of emotional vulnerability and social vulnerability. So being separated from your from others in an extended investigation and you're feeling alone matters a whole lot more to adolescents than it does to adults. It's much harder to resist being influenced in that situation. So there's adjudicative competence is one area. Another one, of course, is in the area of culpability and mitigation. And sometimes I think there's a straw person argument that goes, well, just because they're young, do you just say they're not guilty of anything? Well, of course not. There is culpability, and we have to take that into account. We have to deal with that. We have to restore some sense of understanding what you are culpable of and why you're responsible for it and how you're going to go forward from this point in time. But there is mitigation, right? It doesn't mean necessarily the same thing for all of the reasons, both in terms of behavioral science, psychological science, and neuroscience that I've talked about. The third one, and in some ways the most important, I'll talk about this a bit more in a moment, is the rehabilitative prospects, right? So in a sense, what we can tell from this notion of plasticity is that this character development is still unformed and is formable, right? There is stuff we can do that will make a difference to them at this point in time, but that they will then carry forward with them going throughout life. So they are much more amenable than, let's say, a 35-year-old career criminal to undergo this. Now, I'm a developmentalist and an optimist, and I never believe that no change is possible. I think change is always possible. It's just one heck of a lot harder in some circumstances than in others. In the circumstances where you have a still developing organism, particularly in the brain area, as I've talked about, it means that you have a much better shot. You have the ability or the receptivity, if you will, at least physiologically in terms of brain development, to be able to make that kind of a difference. So I think with all of these things, we need to think very carefully about what's the age at which we would expect individuals ought to be considered fully capable of being able to deal with the criminal justice system as an adult criminal justice system, and you're on your own in that setting just like everybody else who's an adult. Versus at what point should we be thinking about when ought we to be thinking about the kinds of accommodations that would be important in terms of both providing an avenue towards positive future development, shifting that trajectory towards a more positive development, which is obviously beneficial for that individual, but it's beneficial for the society because there's one less individual out there who is going to be contributing and is going to be not threatening public safety and security, right? And so those issues are ones that I think we need to think about very carefully as we deal with these issues. And I think that and there are a variety of ways that this has been shown, you know, sort of, and I'm not a legal scholar, but just looking at the headline cases, the Supreme Court cases on, you know, capital punishment, juvenile life without parole, the necessity to review juvenile life without parole, prior sentences and so forth, which is sometimes honored more in the breach than in the reality, but nevertheless, those patterns, if we look at what underlies that, there are a couple of things that I would point to. One is that if you read the decisions, they're very they in all of those cases, they make reference to scientific briefs from American Psychiatric Association, American Psychological Association, relying on this developmental neuroscience that I've just been talking about. That is a part of the story. And I mentioned at the very beginning, for whatever reasons, and I'm not necessarily sure that they're great reasons, a picture of a brain is worth about 15,000 words. And so that evidence has been very much taken into judicial thinking at the highest levels around these sorts of things. Earlier on, I think much of the, if you read the earliest judgments and then the later ones, the earlier ones tended to have more of a reliance on the issue of mitigation of culpability, right? That there may be developmental reasons why the individual was not as able to control their behavior as someone who's more mature, who's fully mature, would be able to do. And that's a reason that we should think very long and hard, or in the case of capital punishment, just outlaw for some individuals that's a sanction, that we should forego that sanction. More recently, there's a big, more functional immaturity per se, and particularly on the prospects for rehabilitation. So the most recent decisions have emphasized more the propensity or the chance of being able to see change going on, and refer specifically to the kind of, I don't think they use the term in the decision, but they refer the briefs that do, neuroplasticity, right? That there's a lot of possible change that's going on there. And so the neuroscience evidence to me seems entirely persuasive that we should be very strongly pushing for a juvenile justice system that is widespread. Now the question comes up, where do you draw the lines? By the scientific evidence, you might say, well, individuals are not really fully mature in the brain until the mid-20s, so maybe we should extend the juvenile justice system up to mid-20s. I think that's a policy non-starter, at least at this point in time, but the scientific evidence doesn't give us a particular thing that says, 16 is fine, 17 is fine, 18 is fine, 20 is fine, 22 is fine. We can't do that. Scientifically, we can't do that. So this is where we've got the intersection of what the science is telling us and what's possible policy-wise, and what are the legal implications of making various decisions. But if we look at it in terms of certain kinds of things that are going on, what markers can we use in terms of being able to look at this? There are some that we can look at. When do we allow voting, right? Well, we allow voting at age 18. Contracts, depends on what kind of contract. Many times, though, you can't really be in a binding contract before around 18, sometimes later than that. What I'm going to talk about in just a moment, looping back to something from the very beginning, is the definition of children's rights, which may seem an odd thing to bring up for adolescents, but I'll say why I think it's not an odd thing. And the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child defines 18 as the age of maturity for the purposes of getting special protections from state actors in terms of that. Now, after South Sudan signed it and ratified it, the United States is the only country not to have ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It was signed by Clinton, but never ratified for political reasons everybody can understand. But it is, an established international document, and I think that provides us an opportunity to say, oh, there's a marker as well, right? So we can't give precise markers from a scientific perspective, but there is a legal necessity to have some kind of a firm line. And if we're looking for where there's a consensus about a line, 18 comes up a bunch of times in other domains. So I think that that's not an unreasonable way to think about the situation. There was a reference there that's blanked out. I don't know why. It's not redacted. I think I just didn't do a very good job of the PowerPoint. Anyway, anybody who wants some references, I can. I want to talk just for a moment about this, is why should we even pay attention to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child? And we had a consensus paper for Adolescence Journal that I worked with a former student of mine, Martin Ruck, on this, and the other one is a kind of a more elaborated thing on how neurodevelopment plays into this. But the benchmark of the CRC, which has it as up to age 18 years, essentially is that individuals, the Convention on the Rights of the Child essentially says that there are two major areas in which state actors are responsible to provide special protections for children, right? One of them is in terms of self-determination rights. And that obviously there's this notion of an evolving capacity of the child. You can't say, oh, well, a 5-year-old is able to do whatever they want, right? That's not the point. But the point is that they're within limits, there should be the opportunity for individuals to become autonomous actors and special protections for them to do that. The other one is in the, and very frequently people think, oh, well, that's the one that has to do with adolescence, and it does, but there are ways to think about the way in which it applies younger as well. The one that typically is thought to apply to younger children but not adolescents, and we argued why that should not be the way we think about it, is the notion of nurturance, right? That individuals should have, and by treaty for those countries that ratify it, do have a responsibility or do have an expectation of special protections in the area of nurturance up until age 18 when it is state actors that are engaged in it. Well, there's hardly any more direct thing by saying, oh, well, you're actually going to be dealt with in an adult criminal system. That's hardly special protections under the notion of what the CRC is about, right? So essentially, the notion of the CRC says that adolescents still have a right to special protections, not that it wipes away culpability or all of the other shibboleths that go around, but that indeed we recognize that there is a special case here up to that point in time. Now, scientifically, I might argue for older, but nevertheless, given that situation, is to say, look, this is something that we've committed to. This is something that the international community acknowledges. Again, honored more in the breach, perhaps, but still, it is one that I think is a legitimate entry into the argument here about what we should be thinking about. And this applies, of course, to the standard age at which we would think about when transfer to or when adult court individuals wind up going to adult court, waivers of various kinds, and so forth. As you all know better than me, that's a patchwork by state across the country. And very frequently we see situations where kids much younger than this are getting waived to adult court for things that are really perhaps not as dramatic as one might suspect. And some of the arguments, both legal and just everyday, around the juvenile life without parole fit into the same category, right? In a sense that you're essentially saying this individual is beyond rehabilitative options, right? That's the decision. Well, in most cases for kids who are in that situation, that doesn't square with the evidence that we have, right? We are not even sure that we can fully identify psychopathy in adolescents. That's still very much an issue that's up for debate. And the prospect for change for the vast majority of individuals in the adolescent period is quite clear. So let me just summarize then by having gone through the whole story here. Let me just bring it back to where we should be. I think this tells us that we should be thinking about it. One, desistance is the rule. I didn't go through that evidence. I think everybody knows that. But desistance is what happens in the vast majority of cases. We should pay attention to that. We can promote that desistance when we are dealing with juveniles in a juvenile justice system rather than in an adult criminal system. They, in fact, have their prospects for growth towards a more positive and responsible member of the society is enhanced when they're in the situation. And both in that more supportive situation or in divergence systems or restoration systems, even more so. But dealing with them as special cases in need of special protection, it's not just that we have maybe a moral belief in that, not everybody shares the same view of that, but just from a straight utilitarian point of view, we wind up with fewer career criminals when we do it that way, right? Well, we all ought to be in favor of that, I think. And the basis for all of this, I think, rests very firmly on contemporary science, particularly in the area when we look at what we're finding in terms of neuroplasticity. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Dan. That was great. So we're going to take a short break now, 15 minutes. We'll have time for questions related to our first keynote as well as the other presentation, sprinkled throughout as well as at the end. So we'll take a short 15-minute break now, come back for 10:30. Thanks.